Kristen Stewart didn't just give a speech, she lit a match. At the Academy and Chanel Women's Luncheon in Los Angeles, the actress turned director stepped to the podium and delivered one of the boldest statements Hollywood has heard in years. In a trembling but defiant voice, Stewart called out the elephant in the room: the devastating lack of progress for women in the film industry after the Me Too movement. What we're facing, she said, is a backslide, and it's statistically devastating. This wasn't a polite speech. It was a reckoning. Before an audience filled with some of the most powerful women in Hollywood, Kate Hudson, Riley Keough, Felicity Jones, Tessa Thompson, Alicia Silverstone, and director Patty Jenkins, Kristen's words cut through the air like electricity. She spoke of the boys' club business model that still dominates Hollywood, pretending to welcome women while quietly stealing their space and silencing their truth. "I'm so angry," she confessed. "The violence is silencing. We're not even supposed to show it. But I could eat this podium with a fork and knife. I'm so angry." And then came the number that stunned everyone. Just 3 major studio films this year were directed by women. 3 for an industry that prides itself on progress. It was a cold reminder that the revolution so many hoped for never fully arrived. Kristen's fury wasn't theoretical. She had just completed her directorial debut, The Chronology of Water, a deeply personal, raw, and emotional film that faced rejection for being too dark and too female. Now, standing under the spotlight, she turned that rejection into defiance. This was not a press moment. It was a declaration, a line in the sand for every woman in the room and every young filmmaker still waiting to be heard. Kristen Stewart has never been the kind of Hollywood star who hides behind politeness. From her early days in Twilight to her transformation into one of cinema's most fearless indie actresses, she has always chosen truth over comfort, raw emotion over safe fame. But this speech, this moment, came from somewhere deeper. For years, Kristen has watched Hollywood celebrate progress on paper while quietly pushing women back into silence. The Me Too movement had promised a new era, one where women's voices would be heard, respected, and given equal weight. And for a moment, it seemed real. Stories made by women started to rise. Films about survival, strength, and sisterhood began to win awards and box office success. But like a wave that hit the shore and pulled back, that energy began to fade. The red carpets went back to normal. The studio boardrooms filled again with men in suits making the same decisions. And the number of films directed by women began to drop quietly, consistently, almost invisibly. Kristen felt that decline firsthand. While developing her first feature film, The Chronology of Water, she encountered the kind of resistance that has silenced women for decades. Comments that her story was too raw, too dark, too emotional. Words that, in Hollywood, are often used to disguise fear. Fear of a woman speaking too honestly about the world. But Kristen refused to soften her vision. Instead, she finished her movie exactly as she intended, an unapologetic portrait of female pain, rebirth, and survival. So when she stood before that crowd in Los Angeles, she wasn't just reading words from a teleprompter. She was speaking from the trenches, from the frustration of a woman who fought to tell her story and almost got buried under the weight of an industry that still resists change. For her, this wasn't just another Hollywood luncheon. It was a battlefield. The lights were warm, the crowd powerful. Dozens of Hollywood's most influential women sat shoulder to shoulder, their designer gowns shimmering beneath the chandeliers of the Academy Museum's rooftop hall. But as Kristen Stewart began to speak, the air shifted. There was no script to protect her, no PR polish, just a woman trembling with conviction. She started softly acknowledging the success of women who had fought for a seat at the table. Then her tone changed. Her voice tightened, sharpened, and cracked with fury. In a post-Me Too world, she said, "We were promised progress. We were told our stories mattered. But every time a woman dares to tell her truth, she's called too emotional, too difficult, too dark." Her words echoed across the room, each sentence cutting deeper. Cameras clicked, heads turned, Some nodded in agreement, others sat frozen, unsure how to react. Then came the moment no one will forget. Kristen paused, looked down at the podium, and said, half laughing, half crying, "I'm in a severe state of PMS today, but maybe that's a good thing." The crowd burst into laughter, a sudden release of tension. And then she added, her tone blazing with honesty, "My nerves are right at the surface of my skin, and maybe that's exactly what today needs." The laughter faded into silence. And in that silence, she delivered the line that would travel across the internet within hours. "We can measure inequality in wage gaps and taxes on tampons. But the real violence is silencing being told to shut up, to calm down, to be grateful. I could eat this podium with a fork and knife. I'm so angry." The room exploded in applause. It wasn't polite clapping, it was raw, cathartic, almost defiant. In that moment, every woman in the audience felt seen. For Kristen, it was more than a speech, it was an exorcism, a release of everything she'd held back for years. The exhaustion, the rage, the exhaustion of pretending things had changed when they hadn't. That was the turning point, the moment her truth stopped being personal and became universal. And by the time she stepped down from the stage, Hollywood would never look at her the same way again. By the time Kristen Stewart stepped off that stage, the room was already buzzing. Conversations broke out in every corner, quiet, urgent, electric. Some guests were wiping tears, others were nodding in fierce agreement. What began as a luncheon had turned into a moment of reckoning. Within hours, her words spread like wildfire across Hollywood. Clips of her speech flooded social media. Headlines appeared everywhere, Kristen Stewart's furious call for change. Stewart's unfiltered truth hits Hollywood hard. Actress, directors, and producers reposted her quotes, turning her anger into a collective roar. Patty Jenkins, the director of Wonder Woman, praised her courage, saying, she said, "What we've all been thinking." Younger stars like Barbie Ferreira and Riley Keough called the speech necessary and unapologetically real. Even fans who had followed Kristen since her twilight years saw her in a new light, not just as a movie star, but as a leader, someone who wasn't afraid to burn down the illusion of equality that Hollywood had been selling for years. But beyond the applause, there was tension. Inside the industry, a few executives quietly complained that her tone was too confrontational. Others whispered about whether her honesty would affect her upcoming film release. The same cycle she had described silencing, avoidance, discomfort began to play out in real time. Yet Kristen didn't seem to care. She didn't issue follow-up statements. She didn't apologize. She let her words stand on their own sharp, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Days later, photos surfaced of her leaving a small Los Angeles cafe with her wife. Screenwriter Dylan Mayer. No makeup, no entourage. Just two people holding hands and laughing. The image went viral, a perfect contrast to the fire she'd unleashed on stage. The world had seen her rage, and now it saw her peace. Across Hollywood, one question kept echoing. If Kristen Stewart was brave enough to speak this truth aloud, who will be brave enough to act on it? In the days after her speech, the noise began to settle, but the echo of Kristen Stewart's words refused to fade. They lingered in studio boardrooms, in film schools, in quiet conversations between producers and directors who suddenly had to confront the truth she had screamed into the open. Kristen didn't plan a movement that day. She didn't organize a campaign or write a manifesto. She simply stood on a stage, cracked open her anger, and dared to be heard without apology, without diplomacy, without the fear of being labeled too much. For years, she had been misunderstood, the shy star, the rebel, the woman who didn't play Hollywood's game, but this moment changed everything. Kristen Stewart was no longer just an actress or a director. She had become a voice raw, flawed, human, and unfiltered. Her film, The Chronology of Water, became more than a debut project. It became a symbol of what she had fought for, a woman telling her story exactly as she wanted to. In a world that still tries to edit female truth, when the film premieres this December, it won't just be another movie release. It will be a test, a question to Hollywood itself. Will the system, she called out, finally listen? But perhaps the true victory is already here, because that day in Los Angeles, Kristen reminded everyone from rising filmmakers to veterans who've spent decades fighting the same battle that silence is the enemy of progress. That anger, when channeled with courage, becomes fuel. In a city built on illusions, she chose honesty. In a culture addicted to image, she showed vulnerability. And in an industry that still calls women too emotional, she proved that emotion can move mountains. Kristen Stewart's speech will not be remembered for its anger, but for its truth. A truth that may just become the spark for the change Hollywood still owes its women.